The cold was a constant companion, a thief that stole the warmth from her bones and the feeling from her fingertips. Ilara pulled the thin hide tighter around her shoulders, a futile gesture against the wind that sliced through the pines like claws. This was her life now. Exile. A punishment for a crime she did not understand, for a quality she had been born with. They had called it a curse, this strange sensitivity to the whispers of the world, the echoes of pain in the wind and the sorrow in the soil. They had cast her out, away from the warmth of the pack hearth, into the unforgiving maw of the northern wilderness. Her stomach was a hollow ache, a familiar emptiness she had learned to ignore. Survival was a series of small, brutal tasks, checking her snares, foraging for the tough, bitter roots that grew even in the frozen earth, watching the sky for storms, and always staying away from the border of the forbidden lands, a place steeped in shadow and superstition. Her old pack believed it was haunted, a place where spirits screamed and the very ground was poisoned by an ancient grief. Sometimes she thought they had thrown her into a larger cage. The world had shrunk to this patch of frozen forest, her existence a slow, quiet fading. She was worthless. The alpha of her former pack had said the word with such finality, his eyes full of disgust as he'd pointed a finger toward the wilderness. She had believed him. It was easy to believe you were nothing when the world treated you as such. But even in the nothingness, a flicker of something remained. A stubborn refusal to simply lie down and let the snow claim her. She had survived the first winter and the second. She had learned the language of the forest, the snap of a twig that meant deer, the hoot of an owl that meant the hunt was on. She was alone, but she was alive. It was on a day when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise that she found him. She had been tracking a rabbit, its trail faint in the new snow, when a sound reached her, carried on the wind. It was not the sound of any animal she knew. It was a low, guttural sound of pure agony, a rage so profound it felt like it was tearing the air itself. Fear, cold and sharp, lanced through her. Her first instinct was to flee, to retreat to the meager safety of her lean-to. But the sound came again, and woven within the rage was a thread of something else, a desperate, soul-shattering loneliness that resonated with the curse inside her. It called to the hollow place in her own chest. She moved toward the sound, her steps cautious, her hand resting on the hilt of the skinning knife at her belt. The forest grew denser, the ancient pines blocking out what little light the sullen sky offered. And then she saw him. He was a wolf. But that word was too small, too tame. He was a monster from a forgotten age, a creature of myth. His fur was the color of moonlight on snow, a brilliant, ghostly silver. He was massive, his shoulders as broad as a young bear's, his body a knot of furious muscle. And he was caught. An old iron trap, rusted and cruel, had clamped its teeth deep into his front leg. The snow around him was stained a horrifying crimson. He thrashed against it, not with the panicked desperation of a normal animal, but with a cold, calculated fury, his teeth tearing at the unyielding metal. Ilara froze, her breath catching in her throat. This was no ordinary wolf. The power radiating from him was a physical force, a pressure against her skin, and the grief. It poured from him in waves, a sorrow so immense it felt like the death of a star. She could feel it through her curse, a direct line into the heart of his pain. A burning castle, the smell of smoke and blood. A woman's face, screaming before vanishing into nothing. Images, not her own, flashed behind her eyes. She stumbled back, a cry escaping her lips. The wolf's head snapped up. His eyes found her. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were a startling, intelligent silver, burning with a cold fire. They held centuries of pain and a chilling absence of hope. He did not growl at her. He simply watched, his chest heaving, the agony in his gaze a silent accusation. Every instinct screamed at her to run. This creature could kill her with a single swipe of its claws, a single snap of its powerful jaws. He was death-given form, a spirit of the frozen wilderness. But she saw the trap. She saw the blood. And she felt the echoes of his loss, a mirror to her own exile. She was nothing. He was a magnificent broken thing. In that moment, they were the same. "I won't hurt you," she whispered. The words absurdly small in the vast silence of the forest. The wolf watched her, unblinking. He had stopped thrashing, his body held in a tense stillness. Slowly, deliberately, Alara knelt. She unwrapped the rabbit from her belt and laid it on the snow, pushing it gently toward him. An offering, a plea. He ignored it. His silver eyes remained fixed on her face, searching for something. She didn't know what. She took a deep breath, the cold air burning her lungs. "The trap," she said softly. "I can help." This was madness. This was suicide. But the thought of leaving him here to die, to suffer alone in this cold, silent place, was a pain she could not bear. It was a reflection of her own deepest fear. She began to move forward, one slow, deliberate step at a time. The wolf remained still, but a low rumble started deep in his chest. It was not a threat. It was a warning. A sound that said, "I am broken. I am dangerous. Do not come closer." Alara stopped, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could feel the shattered pieces of his spirit. It felt like he had been torn in two. This magnificent beast, just one half of a whole. The other half was gone, lost. "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I know it hurts." She sank to her knees in the snow, her eyes never leaving his. She held out her empty hands, showing him she had no weapon. She was small, weak, no threat to him at all. She was just there, and she was not running away. For a long moment the world held its breath. The wolf's gaze flickered from her face to the trap on his leg, then back again. The rumbling in his chest subsided. With a barely perceptible nod of his massive head, he lowered himself to the ground, laying his head on his paws. It was not submission. It was an allowance, a flicker of trust in a world that had given him none. Alara's breath shuddered out of her. She crawled forward, the snow soaking through the knees of her worn leather trousers. The smell of him filled her senses. Pine, winter air, and the sharp metallic tang of blood. He was radiating a cold that had nothing to do with the weather, a deep internal frost. She reached the trap. It was an old, cruel design, meant for bears. The spring mechanism was rusted tight. It would take all her strength. She placed her hands on the cold iron, her fingers trembling. The wolf watched her every move, his silver eyes luminous. He did not flinch when her arm brushed against his fur. It was surprisingly soft, like spun silk. "This is going to hurt," she murmured, more to herself than to him. She positioned herself, took a deep breath, and pulled. The rust fought her, groaning in protest. The metal was frigid, biting into her skin. The wolf let out a sharp hiss of pain as the jaws shifted, but he did not move. He did not snap at her. He simply endured, his trust a fragile, terrifying weight upon her shoulders. With a final, desperate heave, the mechanism gave. The iron jaws sprang open with a sickening crack. The wolf scrambled back, freeing his mangled leg. He stood, favoring it heavily, blood dripping onto the pristine snow. He was free. Alara collapsed backward, her arms screaming in protest, her lungs burning. She had done it. She had freed a monster. Now it would surely kill her. The great silver wolf took a step toward her. He lowered his head, his nose just inches from her face. She could feel his breath, cold and clean, on her skin. She closed her eyes, waiting for the end. Instead of teeth, she felt something soft and wet brush against her cheek. A gentle lick. It was a gesture of such profound and unexpected gratitude that it shattered the icy wall around her own heart. A single hot tear escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. When she opened her eyes, he was still there, watching her with those ancient silver eyes, but the cold fire in them had banked, replaced by a flicker of something else: curiosity, wonder. He turned and limped a few paces away, then stopped, looking back at her over his shoulder. He was waiting. For her. Slowly, shakily, Alara got to her feet. She looked at the blood-stained snow, at the magnificent wounded creature, and at the path leading back to her lonely camp. Then she looked in the direction he was facing, toward the deepening shadows that marked the edge of the Forbidden Lands. He was broken. She was an outcast. Perhaps broken things belonged in broken places. Without a word, she started walking. And the great silver wolf, the ghost of the forest, fell into step beside her. She called him Ghost. It seemed to fit. He moved with a preternatural silence, his silver form melting into the snow and shadows. In the days that followed, a strange and unspoken partnership formed between them. He was her guardian, her provider. Though his leg was still healing, he was a peerless hunter. He would leave a fresh kill, a deer, an elk, near her camp, then retreat to a distance to watch her with his unnervingly intelligent eyes. She, in turn, became his healer. She knew the properties of the forest herbs, which ones would numb the pain, and which would ward off infection. Each evening she would build a small fire, and he would lie near its warmth, allowing her to clean and dress the wound on his leg. She would speak to him in a low, soft voice, telling him about her life, her exile, the loneliness that felt like a constant winter inside her. He would listen, his head on his paws, his silver gaze never leaving her. She knew he understood. More than that, she felt he knew. Through the strange connection her curse afforded her, she felt his own story in fragments. The grief was a constant, a cold ocean beneath the surface of his being. The flashes of memory came more frequently now. A throne room of dark, polished wood, a council of stern-faced men, a heavy crown, the overwhelming weight of responsibility. Who was he? What was he? He was no mere wolf. He was a king in exile, a spirit trapped in a cage of fur and fang. They drifted deeper into the wilderness, their path leading them inevitably toward the border of the Forbidden Lands. The stories of her youth screamed at her to turn back. But the pull was undeniable. It was a resonance, a humming in her bones that her curse amplified. The land was in pain, and it was the same pain she felt from Ghost. One evening, as she tended to his leg, her fingers brushed against a patch of fur on his shoulder. A sigil, a brand, was hidden beneath the thick coat. It was a stylized wolf's head, crowned, the royal seal of the Alpha King. Alara snatched her hand back as if burned. The truth crashed down on her with the force of an avalanche. Kale, the Alpha King, the ruler of the entire northern Concord, a man spoken of only in whispers. A king said to be as cold and merciless as the winter itself. A recluse who had not been seen outside his mountain fortress in decades, ever since the fire that had claimed his mate and his entire family. They said the tragedy had broken him, that it had frozen his heart. They never said it had literally torn him in two. This magnificent beast, this gentle companion who brought her food and listened to her sorrows, was the feral, untamed spirit of the most powerful man in the world, his feral wolf. And she, a nameless exile, had been caring for him. Fear warred with a fierce protective instinct. The king was a remote, terrifying figure. But Ghost was her friend, her only friend. "You're him," she whispered, her hand hovering over the hidden seal. The great wolf lifted his head and met her gaze. There was no denial in his silver eyes, only a profound, aching sadness. Yes. That night, she dreamt of a man with silver eyes and a crown of ice, sitting alone on a throne in a cold, empty castle. He clutched his own shoulder, right where the brand was on Ghost, a phantom pain echoing across miles of wilderness. He was a man, and he was a wolf, and they were both trapped, alone. They crossed the border into the Forbidden Lands the next day. The air changed instantly. The silence was deeper, the shadows longer. The trees were twisted into shapes of agony. Ilara could feel the sorrow of the land as a physical weight, a sickness in the air. But Ghost seemed calmer here. The frantic edge to his grief lessened as if he had come home. She realized this was where the fire had been. This was the heart of his pain. It was here, in the shadow of a skeletal, burned-out ruin that must have once been a royal lodge, that they saw the banners. They appeared over a ridge, a line of dark figures against the gray sky. Men in black armor carrying the crowned wolf sigil of the Alpha King, an army. They moved with silent, deadly efficiency, fanning out, their eyes scanning the desolate landscape. Ilara's blood ran cold. He had sent them. King Kyle, the man in the castle, had sent his soldiers. For his wolf, and for her. Ghost let out a low growl, pushing her behind him protectively. She saw it all in a flash of terror. The king knew she was here. He knew she had his other half. He would think she had stolen him, lured him away. He would reclaim his wolf and kill the worthless exile who had dared to touch what was his. The stories were true. He was merciless. He sent them to kill me, she breathed, her hand going to Ghost's thick fur. The wolf looked back at her, a confused, questioning light in his eyes. He could feel the king's intent, a desperate need to bring them back, to be whole. But he could also feel Ilara's terror. He was caught between the two halves of his fractured world. The soldiers spotted them. A horn blew, a sharp, piercing cry that echoed off the dead trees. "We have to run," Ilara urged, her voice tight with panic. Without hesitation, Ghost turned and ran. He moved with a desperate speed, his heeled legs strong and sure. Ilara ran with him, her lungs burning, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. They plunged deeper into the twisted heart of the Forbidden Lands, the sound of the hunting horn and the shouts of men pursuing them. She was running with the Alpha King's feral wolf, and he had sent an army after them. The fairy tale had become a nightmare. The chase was relentless. They ran for what felt like days, the black-armored soldiers always just behind them, their pursuit as patient and inexorable as the winter. Ghost knew the land, leading them through hidden ravines and over treacherous, icy ridges where horses could not follow. But the soldiers were wolves too. They shifted, their powerful four-legged forms tireless, their senses sharp. Ilara was the weak link. Her body, already worn down by years of hardship, screamed in protest. Her lungs burned, her muscles ached, but she refused to slow down. She would not be the reason Ghost was captured. She would not be taken. Through their bond, she felt the conflict raging within the wolf. He felt the king's pull, a desperate summons to come home. But he also felt Ilara's terror, and his loyalty, forged in pain and kindness, was to her. He chose her. He ran with her, defying the command of his other self. This only strengthened her resolve. He was protecting her. She had to protect him. They found temporary shelter in a shallow cave hidden behind a frozen waterfall. Huddled in the darkness, sharing the last of her dried rations, Ilara shivered, and not just from the cold. The army was a physical presence out there in the darkness, a ring of steel closing in around them. "Why?" she whispered into Ghost's fur as he curled around her, his massive body a shield against the wind. Why does he want to kill me? Ghost nudged her with his nose, a soft whine in his throat. He laid his head in her lap, his silver eyes full of a sorrow she was beginning to understand. He couldn't explain that the king's command, "Find the woman with my wolf, bring them both back," had been one of desperate hope, not malice. He couldn't tell her that for the first time in decades, the king was feeling something other than a cold void. He was feeling her kindness, her warmth, her strength, all through the senses of his lost wolf. He was not hunting her to punish her, he was hunting her to save himself. All Alara knew was the fear, the horns in the distance, the sight of armored men. In her world, powerful men did not come for worthless girls unless it was to deliver a punishment. The next morning, they were cornered. They emerged from the cave to find their escape route cut off. A deep, impassable chasm lay before them, and the sounds of the pursuit were closing in from behind. But it was not the army that appeared first. It was a single rider, clad in ornate silver and black armor that marked him as a high-ranking commander. He dismounted, his movements fluid and confident. He had a cruel, handsome face and eyes that were as cold and sharp as chips of obsidian. "Well, well," the man said, his voice a silky, dangerous purr. "The stray beast and its little pet." Ghost moved in front of Alara, his body a tense wall of muscle, a low growl vibrating in his chest. The hair on his back stood on end. He knew this man. The scent of him was tangled with the memory of rusted iron and blinding pain. "Lord Valerius," Alara breathed, recognizing the name. He was the king's chief advisor, a man whispered to be the true power behind the throne. Valerius smiled, a thin, predatory expression. "So the little exile knows my name. I'm flattered. I must say I'm impressed. No one has ever gotten this close to the king's feral half before." I wondered what had calmed him. Turns out it was just a spirit-touched stray. His eyes flickered to Ghost. "I set that trap for you, you know. A pity you escaped. A crippled beast is so much more manageable. Just like a broken king." The words hit Alara like a physical blow. Valerius. He had set the trap. He wanted Ghost hurt. He wanted the king. Broken. "You," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. "You don't want him to be whole." Valerius laughed, a cold, empty sound. "Whole? My dear girl, the king hasn't been whole since the fire, and a king consumed by his grief is a king who leaves the tedious business of ruling to more capable hands. Your little healing act threatens a very delicate balance, a balance I have worked for decades to maintain." He drew his sword. The blade was not steel. It was silver, gleaming with a pale, hungry light. "The king wants you brought to him," Valerius said, advancing on them. "But he is conflicted, unwell. I, on the other hand, know what's best for the kingdom. And what's best is for his little distraction to disappear, and for his wolf to be put on a much shorter leash." He was not following orders. He was twisting them. He was going to kill her, and blame it on the chase, on the dangers of the Forbidden Lands. "No," Alara whispered. Ghost did not wait for another word. He launched himself at Valerius, a blur of silver fur and righteous fury. He was magnificent, a storm of claws and teeth, a king's rage made manifest. But Valerius was ready. He was a cunning warrior, and he had his silver blade. He met the wolf's charge not with brute force but with a swift, calculated sidestep. As Ghost flew past, Valerius spun, the silver sword flashing in a deadly arc. It sliced deep into Ghost's flank. The wolf let out a terrible cry, a sound of shock and agony that tore through the frozen air. He stumbled, his legs buckling, and crashed to the ground. Dark blood, almost black against his silver fur, poured from the wicked wound. Miles away, in a temporary command tent at the edge of the Forbidden Lands, Alpha King Kale screamed. He collapsed to his knees, clutching his side, an identical phantom wound blooming with excruciating pain across his own body. His guards rushed to his side, their faces masks of alarm, as their king writhed on the ground, his eyes wide with a pain that was not his own. The bond, the raw, untamed connection to his other half, had become a conduit for agony. Alara saw none of that. She only saw Ghost, her ghost, lying broken in the snow. She saw Valerius standing over him, raising the bloodied silver sword for the killing blow. The world went silent. The wind died. The shouts of the approaching army faded into a distant hum. All that existed was the monster with the sword and the dying friend at his feet. Something inside Alara, something that had been dormant and afraid for her entire life, broke free. The cold that had been her constant companion was burned away by a sudden, violent heat. It was not the warmth of a fire, but the heat of a star being born. The curse, the whisper touch she had been taught to hate and fear, was not a curse at all. It was a conduit, a connection to the life force of the world, to the spirits of earth and sky. "Get away from him," she said. Her voice was different. It was not the whisper of a frightened exile. It was calm, clear, and resonant with a power that made the very air tremble. Valerius paused, his sword held aloft. He turned to look at her, a flicker of surprise on his cruel face. He saw a girl, small and insignificant, standing with her fists clenched, her eyes blazing with an impossible light. "Or what, little stray?" he sneered. "Will you talk him to death?" Alara didn't answer with words. She walked forward, closing the distance between them, and knelt beside Ghost. She laid her hands on the terrible bleeding wound. The wolf was whimpering, his life fading, his silver eyes clouded with pain. He looked at her, a silent, desperate plea. "Don't let me die alone." "I am here," she whispered. "I have you." And she pushed, not with her muscles, but with her spirit. She pushed all of her hope, her grief, her fierce and desperate love for this broken creature, down through her hands. Light erupted from her palms. It was not the yellow light of a flame, but a pure, white gold energy that pulsed with life. It poured into the wolf's body, sealing the wound, knitting flesh and muscle back together. The silver of Valerius's blade, a poison to their kind, was burned away by the purity of her power. But she didn't stop there. The connection she had forged with Ghost was a bridge. On the other side of that bridge she could feel him, the other half, the man, the king. He was dying miles away, sharing the wolf's wound. He was cold and alone in his pain. She reached for him. With her mind, with her spirit, she grabbed the frayed, broken tether that connected man and wolf and pulled. "You are not separate," she thought, the command a silent roar that echoed in the spiritual plane. "You are one." In his tent, Kale gasped as the phantom pain vanished, replaced by a surge of warmth and energy he hadn't felt in 30 years. He felt a hand, gentle but firm, grasp his soul. He felt a voice, not of words but of pure intent, calling him home, calling him back to himself. A column of golden light shot into the sky from the chasm's edge, a beacon in the gray, desolate landscape. The approaching army stopped dead in their tracks, shielding their eyes, their hearts filled with a primal awe. Valerius stumbled back, his sword falling from his nerveless fingers. He stared in horror as the light coalesced, flowing between the girl and the wolf. The air crackled with power. The ground beneath their feet hummed. Ghost rose to his feet, the wound on his flank gone, leaving no scar. His silver fur seemed to glow from within. But he was not just a wolf anymore. Something had changed. He looked at Alara, and in his eyes, she saw not just the wild spirit she had come to love, but the keen, ancient intelligence of the king. The light faded, leaving Alara kneeling, panting, drained but resolute. She looked up at Valerius, her eyes still holding the faint echo of her power. "He is whole," she said. Valerius's face was a mask of disbelief and terror. He had lost. In a single moment, his decades of careful manipulation had been undone by a worthless, spirit-touched exile. He turned to run, to escape before the king could arrive. He didn't get 2 steps before a massive silver paw slammed him to the ground, pinning him as easily as a child would pin a beetle. The pounding of hooves and running feet grew louder. The army had arrived. They crested the ridge and poured down into the clearing, swords drawn, only to halt in confusion at the scene before them. Their treacherous commander was pinned beneath the king's legendary wolf, who was standing calmly beside a small, unassuming woman. And then, he arrived. He walked through the ranks of his own soldiers, who parted for him like the sea. He was no longer the broken, grieving man who had collapsed in a tent. He was the Alpha King. He was tall and powerful, his black hair streaked with silver, his face harsh and beautiful like the mountains themselves. But it was his eyes that held Alara captive. They were the same startling silver as the wolf's, and for the first time in 30 years, they were not cold. They burned with a fierce, steady light, the light of a complete soul. He did not look at his soldiers. He did not look at the traitor pinned beneath his wolf's paw. His gaze went straight to Alara, and only to her. He walked across the snow-covered ground until he stood before her. The most powerful man in the world, and the worthless exile. He stopped, his expression unreadable, a mix of awe, gratitude, and 1,000 other emotions she couldn't name. Alara's heart hammered in her chest. This was it. The moment of judgment. He slowly raised a hand. She flinched, expecting a blow. Instead, his fingers, calloused and warm, brushed a stray strand of hair from her face. His touch was impossibly gentle. "You brought him home," Kale said, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse and emotion. He glanced at the great wolf standing faithfully at his side, then back to her. "You brought me home." The world fell away. There was no army, no traitor, no frozen wasteland. There was only the look in his eyes, a look that saw past the dirt and the worn clothes, past the brand of exile, and saw her. He saw her worth. He saw the power she had thought a curse. He saw her, and he was not disgusted. He was grateful. Tears she hadn't even known she was holding back began to fall freely down her cheeks. They were not tears of fear or sorrow. They were tears of relief, of being found after being lost for so long. Kale's thumb gently wiped a tear from her cheek. His expression softened, the harsh lines of his face easing into something she had only ever seen in the eyes of his wolf, a deep, quiet tenderness. "I sent them to find you," he said softly, his voice for her alone. "I felt you. I felt your kindness. I had to find you. I'm sorry if I frightened you." The words were a balm on her wounded soul. He hadn't been hunting her. He had been searching for her. "I didn't understand," she whispered. "Neither did I," he admitted. "Until now." He looked at her, truly looked at her, and a slow smile touched his lips. It was like watching the sun rise after a lifetime of winter. It transformed his entire face, chasing away the last of the shadows. "My name is Kale," he said, as if they were 2 strangers meeting for the first time. "Alara," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Alara," he repeated, and her name on his lips sounded like a promise. "The woman who ran with my wolf, the woman who made me whole." He took her hand, his large, warm one enveloping her small, cold one. "Come home with me, please." She looked from his face to the great silver wolf, who nudged her hand with his nose in encouragement. She looked at the army of soldiers, now watching with expressions of stunned reverence. She was no longer Alara the exile. She was Alara, the woman who had healed the king. She looked back into Kale's silver eyes and saw her future. A future with warmth, with belonging, with him. Yes, she said. And for the first time, the word felt like her own. 6 months passed. The snows of winter gave way to a vibrant green spring. The forbidden lands were no longer forbidden. Under Ilara's gentle guidance, the spiritual poison that had blighted the landscape for so long began to recede. New growth, bright and fearless, pushed its way through the scorched earth. The ghosts of the past were finally finding peace. The Northern Concord had a queen. She wore no crown of gold or silver, but her presence was a more powerful symbol of the kingdom's restoration than any jewel. The stories of the spirit-touched exile who had mended the Alpha King's shattered soul were told in hushed, awed whispers around every hearth. She was not feared for her power, she was loved for it. Lord Valerius was in the deepest dungeon of the mountain fortress, stripped of his titles and his power, left to contemplate his treachery in the cold and the dark. Justice had been swift and absolute. Ilara stood on a balcony overlooking the capital city, the warm spring breeze toying with her hair. She was dressed in simple but fine linens, the coarse hides of her exile a distant memory. But the real change was not in her clothes. It was in the quiet confidence with which she held herself. The hollow ache of worthlessness was gone, filled with a love so profound it felt like the sun lived in her chest. Strong arms wrapped around her from behind, and a familiar warmth pressed against her back. Kale rested his chin on her shoulder, his presence a comforting, solid weight. "What are you thinking about?" he murmured, his voice still holding that slight roughness she had come to adore. "I was thinking about how much can change," she answered softly. "How a place that was full of pain can learn to heal." "It had a good teacher," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. He was no longer the cold, haunted man from the stories. Being whole had unlocked not just his power, but his heart. He was a kind and just ruler, but the softest parts of him, the quiet smiles and gentle touches, were reserved for her alone. At their feet, Ghost lay with his head on his paws, his silver eyes watching them with serene contentment. He was a constant companion, a physical manifestation of the bond they shared. Sometimes he was the great wolf, a guardian at their side. At other times, Kale would draw that power into himself, the wolf a silver light in his eyes, a feral grace in his movements. They were two halves of a whole, and she was the heart that beat between them. "They love you, you know," Kale said, gesturing toward the bustling city below. "My people. They see what you've done, not just for me, but for the land." Ilara leaned back against him, a soft smile on her lips. "I only showed it the way. It did the healing itself." She had learned that about power. It wasn't about forcing change. It was about creating the space for healing to begin. He turned her in his arms, his silver eyes searching her face. The love in them was so open, so absolute, it still sometimes took her breath away. "You saved me, Ilara, from a prison of my own making." "We saved each other," she corrected gently, placing a hand over his heart. "A broken wolf and a lonely girl, lost in the woods." He smiled, that slow, beautiful sunrise of a smile. "Then I am glad we were lost." He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was not about passion or possession, but about belonging. It was a kiss that tasted of home. As they stood there, wrapped in each other's arms, a small, tentative sprout pushed its way through a crack in the stone of the balcony, unfurling its new leaves in the warm spring sun. A small thing, easily missed, but it was a promise. Life would grow again, here, in the king's heart, here, in the healed lands, here in the new world they would build together.